please help me welcome our second keynote speaker, Dr. Jill Hobbs.
Thank you, Derek, and as ever, it's always a pleasure to be at this conference. Thank you, Derek, for the invitation to speak today. So as Derek mentioned, ag supply chains, ag-food supply chains is a topic I've worked on for a number of years, and when Derek asked me to speak at the conference a few months ago, I was thinking, well, what particular angle might I want to talk about? What am I going to say today? And I had kind of two ideas on which I thought I would hang this presentation. So back in, as Derek said, I was president of the Canadian Agri-Econ Society in 2003-04. So in 2003, I had to give my CAES Presidential address. And this was the title of the presidential address: Information, Incentives, and Institutions in the Agri-Food Sector. And I was looking at the theme for this conference, Agile Value Chains, Effective Responses to Disruptions in Canada's agri-food sector. So I went back and took a look at what exactly did I say back in 2003. The theme of that address was this idea that we get these exogenous shocks to the agri-food system, and along the lines of the shocks that Yo was talking about earlier this morning. And I talked in that address about these exogenous shocks create new sources of information asymmetry, altering the size and distribution of transaction costs within supply chains. And we get, as a result, what I called institutional adaptation. We get the rise of new policy regimes, we get changes in the way supply chains are organized, and we get things like private public food standards and so forth. So I thought, well, that's actually still a fairly relevant theme, and maybe I go back. So and as I said, I reread that and had to think about, what did I talk about in 2003? So what were the exogenous shocks I talked about in that particular address? Well, I had 4 of them, okay? They were an increased emphasis on food safety. Again, 2003, coming out of some of the points that Yo talked about in his address, we saw big food safety shocks in Europe, a major change in the policy regime in Europe, and also an increased focus on food safety at the industry and policy level here. We had a lot more dialogue around what I called new food quality attributes, credence attributes, things about how food was produced, animal welfare, environmental sustainability, and so forth. I talked about this idea of transformative technologies, and in that context, biotech, and how new technologies in plant breeding and so forth were causing big changes in policy regimes and very different policy approaches, of course, in North America and Europe, and what that meant in terms of transaction costs, organization of supply chains, and so forth. And I talked about the awareness of the environmental impact of agriculture and environmental farm plans and all that type of stuff. So that was, 14 years ago. If we fast forward 14 years, are these things still relevant? Well, I'd argue they are. We're obviously still talking a lot about food safety, the role of public and private standards. We talk a lot about new food quality attributes. Technology, as I'll touch on, of course, really important aspect of our ag system, and thinking about how we design policies around new transformative technologies, and of course, environment and climate change remain really important. Well, I'm not going to give you the same address I did in 2003, but it led me to think about, what's changed in the last 14 years? So I kind of took out a piece of paper and I wrote down what are all some of the new words in our lexicon around the ag and food environment that we really weren't talking about back in 2003. Because for sure these things are still relevant, but are there new, if you like, exogenous shocks, or are there new disruptions in terms of the themes of this conference? So that led me to my sort of second idea for what I might talk about today. So I was thinking about this over the holidays, over the new year, and we watched some of the 2017 come in with the new year, and we watched and if you saw on TV, Rick Mercer count in the new year, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, just up the hill here on Parliament Hill. And of course, at the end of one year, beginning of another, we often have this, notion of a top 10. What were the, top 10 celebrities we lost last year, or top 10 unexpected decisions by voters, and so forth. So I thought, well, maybe that's what I'll do. I'm going to give you my 2017 New Year's top 10, along the theme of what are some, again, exogenous shocks or disruptions in our supply chains, and particularly thinking around, as I said, Some of the things that are still relevant that we talked about, we've been talking about for a number of years, but some things that have only recently become part of our lexicon. Now, these are in no particular order, with perhaps the exception of my number 1, which of course I'll get to at the end, which is perhaps a fairly strategic choice. So number 10, social license. Right? I know this is a term some people don't particularly care for, but it's certainly a term that we have to recognize is talked about a lot in many contexts, but certainly in the context of the ag and food sector. I'd never heard of the word social license a few years ago, and certainly not in 2003 when I gave that CAES Presidential address. And it's a term that in some cases, some people have a hard time getting their heads around. What does social license actually mean? So I went online and thought, in the Canadian agriculture context, what are different organizations saying, or how are they defining social license? So this is how the Canadian Federation of Agriculture defines social license on its website. Within an agricultural producer's context, social license can be defined as the ongoing level of acceptance, approval and trust of consumers regarding how food is produced. And they go on to say that this encompasses the points that I've got in that second bullet point there: economics and affordability, environment, labor, health, biotech, animal welfare. So that's how the Canadian Federation of Agriculture defines social license. This is from CropLife Canada's website. So they have a slightly different take on it, in the sense they talk about social license refers to the level of public trust granted to a corporate entity or industry sector by the community at large and its key consumer base. And then they go on to say public trust is the belief that activities are consistent with social expectations and the values of stakeholders and earned through industry engagement, operating practice, and express values. Social license is slow to build but quick to erode. Industry tacitly garners public trust by doing what is right. So a little bit more along the lines of how social license is built and how it may be vulnerable. And then finally, this is just taken from a presentation by Sean Roya at Alberta Agricultural, Food and Rural Development. I think he's quoting some definitions from the Centre for Food Integrity, but gives a definition of social license as the privilege of operating with minimal formalized restrictions, legislation, regulation, or market requirements based on maintaining public trust by doing what's right. Public trust, a belief that activities are consistent with social expectations and the values of the community and other stakeholders. So these definitions obviously vary a fair bit in terms of how we think about the notion of social license in a Canadian agricultural context. But as you may have noticed, and as what I noticed about these quotes, they have something all in common, and that is they talk about this idea of trust, public trust. Now, this notion of trust is something that, as economists, we've often struggled to grapple to get our heads around how we deal with trust. But we've had a lot of, I think, very valuable work in recent years. Trust is a concept that our colleagues in sociology, psychology have looked at from different dimensions for a number of years. And to some extent, those insights inform some of our ag-econ work in this area. And a number of people have done quite a lot of important work in this area. Ellen Goddard, we're going to hear from Ellen a little bit later in the conference, has done a lot of very interesting work with her colleagues around this notion of trust. As you may know, Ellen and I co-edited a special issue of Food Policy in 2015 around trust. And if you're interested, check out that special issue. It has some very nice empirical pieces around trying to unpack dimensions, drivers, and outcomes of trust in a Canadian, a US, European agricultural context. So when we think about how we model consumer decision-making as economists, we in our traditional utility maximizing models, we think about a rational economic man or woman, a utility maximizing, optimizing agent who's very calculative in the kinds of decisions that they make. But we know, of course, again, from insights from psychology and behavioral economics, that might not always really accurately describe how consumers make decisions in food markets, or indeed how the public responds to information about the ag-food sector. That, in fact, a lot of decision-making is very intuitive, that people use heuristic shortcuts in order to, signals in order to make decisions about food products they might satisfy rather than maximize, and perhaps above all, that consumers are very heterogeneous in how they react to different information about food products and in the choices that they make. So we see lots of very valuable insights from behavioral economics. We had some interesting talks at this particular conference a couple of years ago, looking at some of the insights from behavioral economics. Certainly around trust, there's lots of aspects of that work around what are the factors that define trust. An economic agent demonstrating that they're competent, that they're credible, they demonstrate benevolence. Some of the literature tries to get at, what determines trust, and we think about generalized trust, the extent to which consumers tend to be trusting or not trusting on an individual basis. Institutional trust, that's basically this idea, do people trust? Who do people trust? Do they trust industry, the government, scientists, and so on and so forth? And there's also been some work, one of my PhD students, Rim, a student working on food system trust and brand trust. So we've had some important movements forwards in trying to really understand what drives trust from an economics perspective. Along those lines, we've also seen an increasing work looking at values. So Jason Lusk done some nice work on food values, human values, cultural values. Just a quick plug for one of the posters that you'll see out in the hallway there. My PhD student Yang is doing some really neat work looking at consumers' responses to novel food technologies, trying to build in this idea of cultural values and framing of information. And a lot of that literature, of course, looks at the role of different signals, labels, standards, as we heard a little bit this morning from Yo, how information is framed and so forth. One other thing I think it's important to remember when we're looking at this notion of social license, public trust, consumer decisions, though, is also the influence of major players in the supply chain. We had a series of policy research priorities workshops last spring, organized by CAPI and AAFC, that a number of us attended. And I'm going to refer back to those workshops a couple of times in my comments this morning, but in each workshop, we had a speaker kick the workshop off with some general thoughts about policy research priorities, issues for the ag-food system. So one of the workshops I attended, we were fortunate enough to have Dan Sumner from UC Davis talk about some issues. And I'm paraphrasing him here, but I was struck by one of the comments that Dan made. And he said, when he's thinking about these food issues, he says, I no longer talk about consumers, I talk about buyers. And this is who he was referring to, right? And I think that was a very insightful comment. The role of these decisions that these major buyers and supply chains make are critically important. So A&W deciding to push, launch its natural beef campaign, really important decisions that affect the beef industry. McDonald's, Maple Leaf, and so on and so forth. So I think, again, that's an important thing to remember. We focus a lot on consumer decision-making, and arguably these firms, of course, are responding to how they perceive what they perceive consumers want. But I think we need to maybe do a better job at understanding the kinds of major decisions these buyers make in these food supply chains. So in terms of the supply chain and policy implications coming out of the vast research in this area, we know that there are very complex responses to new food technologies, and it's important to avoid generalizations. Consumers are very heterogeneous, and I could cite numerous studies that back that point up. In terms of social license, value chain relationships that facilitate transparency is recognized to be important. But also this notion of what's the role for credible quality verification. And certainly some work that some of my students have done in the past and other places as well has shown that credible quality verification matters a lot to some consumers, but certainly not all consumers, right? And that becomes difficult when we start to see a very motivated group maybe lobbying for a regulatory response in terms of mandatory labeling and so forth. We need to sort of unpack in terms of what is the market able to do and when is regulation appropriate? Because, of course, there's potential for overlapping quality cues and in terms of a public sector role, is there a public sector role in facilitating credible regulations, or is that something that the market will look after? So that was my number 10, this notion of social license. Number 9, social media. Again, this is something that just wasn't on our radar, I don't think, back in 2003 when I gave that original presidential address. So just to put that in perspective, Facebook was launched in 2004, a year later. YouTube in 2005, Twitter 2006, Snapchat not till 2011. So, think back to a world before social media, we had a very different dialogue around how people are getting information. And obviously some of these some of these exogenous shocks or disruptions I'm going to talk about are very much linked. So social media, what does it mean? Well, obviously the speed of information exchange is completely different than it was just 14 years ago. People are exposed to very diverse sources of information when they're searching for information, or maybe not even searching. This information comes at you. You may be fairly passive in terms of checking your Facebook feed, and people are posting information, and there it is. And we see new ways of displaying and communicating information visually in short clips and so forth. Clearly some negatives that we're all very well aware of, the potential for misinformation, and this notion of confirmation bias. People will seek out information that supports their priors, their beliefs, and ignore other information. So lots of, even beyond, of course, the ag and food sector, fake news on Facebook and so forth, and the challenges that creates for an informed dialogue about issues and policy issues. But I think there's also some important positives, right? So social media creating the potential for much more real-time producer-to-producer connections, right? So you're harvesting in a field, you have an equipment issue on Twitter, talking to other producers in terms of what are some of the solutions to the challenges I'm facing. And of course, the potential to reach new markets and new consumers. I've had a couple of undergrad students in the past years working on, they came to me with ideas about undergrad theses looking at the role of social media in the ag input sector and in the ag retailing sector. So that would be my number 9, the notion that we have this different way of exchanging information, and of course, therefore, the need for social media strategies, both at the firm level but also at the industry level. And we certainly see that increasingly with producer organizations and companies, of course, becoming much more savvy about how they approach social media. But for many of us, it's clearly a learning curve in terms of how we use social media effectively. Number 8. Number 8, I put authenticity. And again, yeah, we may be talking about this a little bit back in 2003, but I don't think to the same extent that we see this notion of authenticity talked about now in the context of agriculture and food in a Canadian context. This is some data from a survey a few years ago, and there's many other surveys, this is one I was involved in, that would tell us something similar. People generally saying they want more information about the food they buy, and they might want it to be traceable to the farm, that they trust locally grown food. I actually considered putting local as a separate one of my top 10 here, but I couldn't have 11, so we stuck with 10. Look, that's an interesting angle in terms of people using the notion of local as a heuristic to signal attributes that may or may not be present in the food, about food safety, environmental impact, and so forth. And I know a number of people, John Crownfield at Guelph, for example, have done some really nice work trying to sort of unpack the drivers behind consumer perceptions of what's meant by local. But if we think about authenticity, we often talk about it in the context of traceability. Now, traceability is something we've talked about for a long time. Certainly back in 2003, that was something a number of people were looking at. You had the industry moving forward with different traceability systems, but they're not necessarily, of course, the same thing. And I've talked about traceability in many contexts over the years, and one of the things I like to talk about when I think about traceability in an ag-food context is the different roles that traceability systems can play. And one of those roles, of course, is risk management. So that's a very important notion of a role of a traceability system. If we get a food safety problem, we can have more effective recalls, fewer people are exposed to potentially harmful food, or, of course, in a livestock disease management perspective, we want to be able to manage herd health. If we get a contagious livestock disease, we want to limit the number of herds that are exposed and limit the amount of time that our borders are closed and so forth. So that's clearly a really important role of a traceability system. We see the Canadian Cattle Identification Agency system being in place since about 2001 and many other livestock species and so forth. So we see a very important role of traceability in that notion of risk management. And that's not particularly new, and that continues to be something that we work on. We also see traceability used more in a value chain context for production and supply chain management efficiencies. So firms thinking about using data within their supply chain to manage their logistics more effectively, or if within maybe in an agricultural feedlot situation, I've got more data about my cattle. Can I use that to enhance productivity and so forth? And then the third role of a traceability system, to my mind, has always been this notion of quality verification, right? So kind of like this ex-ante quality verification. And that's clearly where this notion of authenticity fits in. We can use traceability to verify attributes for consumers. That's a very different notion of the role of traceability, and that's where I think we see a lot more development now than we maybe were seeing 14, 15 years ago. Back in a few weeks ago in November, I was asked to speak at the BC Seafood and Agri-Food Conference on traceability. So, and again, it's something I've talked about a lot, but I thought, well, I'll have a look at the ag media over the last year or so and see what kind of stories come up that relate to traceability. So I'm just going to share some of the headlines with you. Here's one from the Western Producer in October. U.S. avian flu crisis highlighted importance of traceability. So that's that risk management role of traceability systems in poultry and livestock systems. Safekeeping Canada's reputation, the high cost of not meeting new food safety rules, from the Financial Post a year ago, October. Again, that was a story that referenced the role of traceability system for food safety. Oops. Here's another one, again about livestock traceability, goats sector survey designed to calculate traceability costs. But here's one from the Western Producer in July of last year. This story was, again, very much about traceability, but it was nothing to do with food safety, really. Are Canadians paying for fake imported honey? So this was a story much more about the notion of authenticity, the kind of food standards, adulteration issues that Yo was referring to do, which of course may have food safety implications, but this was much more around the notion of people thought this was Canadian honey and real honey, and it wasn't. And then this story, again from October, from ship to store, Cloverleaf looks to tell consumers more about their tuna catch. Again, that was a story that was about traceability, but much more in this notion of an authenticity context. So we've got many examples of different types of traceability systems. I've referred to some of the industry-level livestock traceability systems that we have for risk management, but we're increasingly seeing these systems introduced at the firm or value chain level as part of this authenticity assurance. One of my favorite examples I like to share, and I use this in my classes a fair bit, this is a Saskatchewan example. This is a company called Three Farmers, which is based in southeast Saskatchewan, and they produce a number of products. They really began with this life with this product, camelina oil. So camelina is a high-end salad or cooking oil. It's a relative of the mustard family. It's described as an ancient oil seed. It's very high in omega-3 and vitamin E and so forth. So they produce this camelina oil. What I also find interesting about what Three Farmers does is they've built in this traceability assurance as part of their I guess the marketers would call it their value proposition, right? So each bottle of this camelina oil has this little number. So this is a screenshot that I took from their website. You type it into the website here, and it tells you about that camelina oil. I know you probably can't read that, but it says, when it was seeded in May 2011, so this is a bit of an old example, when it was harvested, the growing conditions, and then a little bit of information about this farmer, Ron, who was growing this camelina oil. So a very different notion of the role of traceability. So Three Farmers obviously figure that their consumers value this additional information about their food product. So I guess my key message about traceability and authenticity is important to know the difference. They're not the same thing, or at least traceability has many other aspects to it, not necessarily just authenticity. So we have an important role of traceability around food safety, emergency risk management, and that's where we see a policy role, obviously, in facilitating these traceability systems or regulating where appropriate. But we also see traceability playing an important role in the private sector in the sense of adopted for efficient management of supply chain logistics, production management, or to give these assurances of authenticity and transparency. So there are very different implications for where there's an appropriate role for policy and where industry or firm level actions deliver those kinds of assurances. Okay, number 7. Sustainability. Now, this is obviously not a new concept in terms of sustainability. We've talked about sustainability for a long time, and this is traditionally how we think about sustainability as 3 pillars of environmental, economic, and social sustainability. And again, a lot of important initiatives around this. For example, the Canadian Roundtable on Sustainable Beef. We had a nice seminar in the department from Brenna Grant from CanFax talking about some of the initiatives in the cattle industry, and we're going to hear from Brenna a little bit later in the conference. I borrowed this slide and the next one from a presentation that Andy Fern from the University of Kent at the time made at this conference. I think it was 2 years ago that Andy was here. And he was talking about different aspects of value chains. And I looked again through his presentation, and I was kind of struck by these two slides because he was talking about sustainability in a value chain context. So he began with this slide, and then he introduced the next one. And the idea is that, it seems that sustainability is taking on many, many new dimensions. And this was his second slide, okay? It's a busy slide, obviously, but the point being that sustainability, yes, it's obviously about environmental, social, economic sustainability, but that taps into issues around soil, climate change, consumers, market access. He's got labor there, health, communication, and so on and so forth. So when we talk about sustainability, I think it's become much more complex dialogue and discussion than perhaps it ever used to be. Again, if I refer you back to the policy research priorities workshops that were run last spring, and again, Dan Sumner's presentation, the one I was at, I've taken this slide directly from his presentation because, again, it touches on, again, I was struck by the many dimensions that he talks about here that feed into sustainability. So I'll just read through some economics of food and ag issues in the new food, slow food environment, and he talks about animal welfare, local environmental externalities, global externalities such as greenhouse gas emissions, local resource use, water and land, energy, localness as a direct virtue, social goals around income for the poor or for underrepresented groups, so that sort of feeds into that fair price discussion perhaps that Yo referenced, rejection of science and technology, rejection of experts' views. And Dan says that none are new, but the unification into the term sustainability is globally powerful. So we had a number of discussions at these policy research priorities workshops around these kind of topics, and I just pulled out a few of the conclusions that came out of that report. So that report's available on the CAPI website. So things like, how might Canada turn the challenge or threat of climate change into an opportunity by taking advantage of its abundant natural resource or abundant resource base? And again, from a sort of notion of an agile value chain perspective as the theme of this conference, I think that's an interesting challenge, I guess, for value chains. How should natural capital, particularly water, be valued, and what types of innovations in ag environment policy instruments are needed to address externalities and to improve adaptability in the sector? And I've edited the last point a little bit, carbon pricing, carbon taxes, and the implications for ag supply chains. So again, the important role of informed policy analysis around things like carbon taxes, so we get a good sense of the impact on the ag sector, as opposed to looking at tweets from politicians to inform us as how carbon taxes might affect the ag sector. So again, important role for policy research in informing our debate around the outcome of these particular environmental issues in particular. All right, number 6. I decided to put food security up here as my number 6. Obviously, again, this is not a new concept. It's something we've talked about for a long time. But I think relative to 2003, we're seeing a lot more discussion of that, clearly as a result of the price hike in the late 2000s that brought a lot more attention to food security. Again, you could have a whole conference on food security, obviously, so I'm just going to give you 2 slides, just a very high level, some thoughts. This is the FAO World Hunger Map, so if you think about food security in an international context, the dark red colored areas here are very high levels of food insecurity, more than 35% of the population. Dark orange, 25 to 35%, and the light orange, around 15 to 25%, moderately high. So, particularly areas of the world, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, as we know, still remaining very big issues around food security or food insecurity. What's behind that, of course, we know income levels and distribution, and just questions around the affordability, availability, and access to healthy, nutritious food. Now, there's many dimensions, of course, to food security. If I talk to my colleagues in the sciences, they recognize that, there are potential solutions, technologies rather, that offer potential solutions to some of these food security challenges around, improved drought tolerance, improved yields for crops and so forth, but real challenges with public rejection of new technologies that become a barrier to the adoption or the commercialization of those technologies in different countries, and of course a de facto trade barrier. So again, one of the things that came out of the Policy Research Priorities Workshop was this discussion around, what's the role of potential to align standards across countries as a potential solution. And as we saw from Yo's talk this morning, that's maybe not as straightforward as it might seem, even within Europe. If you can have chocolate wars and wine wars, certainly when we think about a bigger, more diverse international context, that becomes much more challenging. And again, where we see, I think as Yo alluded to, the role of perhaps private standards becoming a more important way of technology transfer than aligning public standards. So internationally, food security is important, but so it is domestically, and I think we're having increasingly a stronger and more, as is needed, conversation about food security from a domestic perspective. So I took this graphic from a CBC story in 2015. It's based on Stats Canada data from 2011, and as we know, as we might expect, that food security, insecurity issues being prominent in northern remote Indigenous communities, that's a pretty high number for Nunavut there in terms of 36% of the population. And again, largely driven, of course, by poverty, and again, this notion of access to healthy, affordable foods. In a Canadian context, of course, in terms of northern food insecurity, we've got particular supply chain challenges in terms of these very lengthy food supply chains with food coming from the south, major transportation challenges at different times of years, competition issues in those areas and so forth. So it remains a big challenge, and we've had lots of attention to the cost of food in the north. One of the discussions that's underway is what's the feasibility of developing local food systems in those regions. One of my colleagues, David Natcher, is actually leading a new project looking at both the scientific and economic feasibility of local food systems, looking at what are some success stories around value chains that are working well in the north, and can that be replicated? So I think that'll be an interesting work to see that move forward. The other comment I'd maybe have on a sort of domestic context in terms of elsewhere is we see, particularly in the media, a lot of mixed messages about food prices in Canada, and I think it's important that we have some, informed policy analysis, that leads to a little bit more informed discussion around what's driving food prices in Canada, and what are the factors behind, seasonal factors, exchange rate factors behind food prices, rather than occasional alarmist media stories that we tend to see sometimes. Okay, number 5. And again, this is a new one. This is something that we weren't talking about, at least I've never heard of, back in 2003, big data. Again, big data is something I said that's fairly new to us. I think it's an important exogenous change, or maybe not a disruption, but we'll see, to how we think about agriculture and food supply chains. So what is big data? There's, if you're interested in big data in agriculture, there's a really interesting special issue of the International Food and Agribusiness Management Review, just from late last year, that is dedicated to big data in agriculture. So there's some really nice informative papers in here, including a lead-off paper by Steve Sonka out of the US. None of you know Steve. He's obviously worked in this area of precision agriculture and big data for a number of years. So in his paper, this is how Steve Sonka describes big data: the capability to extract information and insights where previously it was economically, if not technically, impossible, I think he means, to do so. And he goes on to quote this, the National Science Foundation in the US, to say that the phrase big data refers to large, diverse, complex, longitudinal and or distributed data sets generated from instruments, sensors, internet, et cetera, et cetera. So we get many different sources of data. And if you look at some of the literature on big data, typically this is how they think, or they define the notion of big data, as having these 3 elements: volume, variety, and velocity. So by volume, we mean just the sheer volume of data. There's a sort of well-cited statistic that something like 90% of the data in the world today was created in the last 2 years. So we see this huge increase in the volume of data. Velocity refers to the the ability to understand and respond to data in real time. So in other words, Google Maps with real-time traffic information would be a good example of velocity. And then variety, just the sheer variety of what we mean by data. So Sonke in his paper talks about, your eyes moving across a page or looking at the screen, that become data. So, and we see certainly psychologists and increasingly marketing researchers using eye tracking data to do some of their analysis of how people respond to messages on a screen and so forth. And in Mike Bolge's paper in this particular special issue, he talks about the difference between precision agriculture and big data. We've been talking about precision ag for a long time. And these types of technologies have been available at the farm level, again, for a number of years now. Abilities, grid or zone soil sampling procedures, which have been shown to potentially increase yields, but have been maybe not adopted to their particular potential, measuring, monitoring, sensing technologies, and so forth. The difference being, though, that in the precision agriculture context, most of that data stays very close to the farm. And of course, when we think about big data, we're talking about, aggregating that data across numerous farms. That data, using a cloud system, moves beyond the farm. The physical custody of that data changes to some extent. And there's a really nice paper in that special issue by Mike Sakuda at the University of Missouri who talks about, property rights, privacy, and competition issues that this big data revolution might pose for the agricultural sector. So issues around the ownership, privacy, and use of farm data. So clearly there's some very important questions around willingness to adopt, willingness to use and share big data that a number of people are beginning to look at. And the idea that the market for agricultural technology providers, or as he calls them, ATPs, to gather, aggregate, and analyze data. So what might be some of the competitiveness issues that warrant some examination? Is there a potential for first-degree price discrimination by these ag technology providers? So customized pricing based on farm attributes to individual businesses. And Sakuda talks about the potential barrier to entry that large incumbent ATPs have a significant data advantage. If you're introducing new ag inputs now, you have access to all of this data, you have a significant information advantage maybe over new entrants to that sector. Is that an issue? I don't know. And he also talks about recent alliances among industry players to share data services resources. The example of Pioneer and Monsanto planning to partner with John Deere to access the yield and monitor other sensitive data. So the question posed, of course, is, well, who owns the data? Who uses it? To what ends is it being put, particularly once it enters these more complex value chain relationships? So I think that I just thought those are really interesting questions that is worth considering a little bit more. We think about big data, though, clearly it's got applications well beyond the farm level, and if we move up the food supply chain, thinking about the role of big data in enhancing transparency and supply chain linkages, so that maybe links back to my authenticity point from earlier, so the potential for big data to improve those supply chain linkages, either through improving management and logistics, but also improving, as we said, transparency within those supply chains. Will it help target new products to new segments? What does that mean for the structure of supply chains globally in terms of, again, access to this data and the ability to innovate around this data? A year ago, last August, in 2015, I was fortunate enough to attend the International Agricultural Economics Conference that was held in Milan. As Yo indicated, we're going to hold the same conference will be in Vancouver in 2018. But at the same time as the conference in Milan, we had the World Expo. And the theme of Expo that year was agriculture and food. So we took some time to visit Expo, and some of you I know were there. I don't know if you came across this, but they had a display, or actually a building, that they purpose-built building in there that was the supermarket of the future. So looking ahead to what kinds of technologies might be available in the supermarket of the future. And I took a couple pictures. I'm sorry, they're a little bit dark, but this is an example. This is a case of fruit juices, but the panel on the right, you kind of would touch it, and up would pop lots of data about those food products, those juice products, their carbon footprint, where the ingredients were from, information about those production environments, and so forth. And then within this supermarket, they had the food displayed in these cases. I think those were processed meat or dairy products. You would kind of wave your hand over the case, and up above would pop up a display with lots of information about the food supply chain, about the source of that food, and so forth. So certainly we're seeing lots of technology that can give us this information or provide this kind of information. And then the question becomes, when does it become economically feasible to build this in? Number 4 in my issues or top 10 here, innovation systems and infrastructure. Again, this is obviously not new, but it remains, I think, a really important dimension of our ag-food system. We've lots of research has shown very clearly high returns to research in Ag&D, but we see declining R&D expenditures, declining rates of ag productivity, and a productivity gap. So that remains a really important question in terms of securing, maintaining a competitive advantage, and thinking about, even moving beyond innovation. What are the pathways to successful commercialization? So we see producer groups funding a lot of very important scientific research, some of which ends up being adopted by producers and some not. So I think that remains a really important question in terms of, how do these innovations make their way to commercializations? How do you make smart decisions early on about the types of innovations that are going to succeed and why? Which models of innovation and funding research have succeeded and why? Richard Gray in my department's done a lot of really interesting work trying to explore different ways of funding that innovation. And also, of course, as we said, determinants of adoption by producers and also by consumers. So in terms of supply chain and policy insights around innovation, clearly it's important to continue thinking about how we have a policy and regulatory environment that fosters innovation, that maybe facilitates collaborative networks, and certainly we've seen different modes over time of how that might work in terms of public-private partnerships and so forth. The other thing I would just touch on, though, it's also important to think about tackling what I would call hidden impediments to research excellence, and this goes beyond ag policy to more general. So things like immigration and visa delays, right? So having, as a university, just recently gone through hiring processes, trying to hire, you want to hire the best person that may not necessarily be a Canadian citizen, trying to hire someone from outside the country becomes, you can do it, but there's a lot of transaction cost to doing that. And if that's true for universities, it's obviously true, must be true for businesses, other research institutions. And if we're serious about having a world-class research environment here, we need to think about that. So that's, finding ways to improve that aspect of policy beyond agriculture. If I think back again to these policy research priorities workshops last year, a lot of discussion around innovation, so questions around, and infrastructure. Does the Canadian ag-food sector have the capacity to exploit emerging opportunities? Is the infrastructure up to the challenge? And I think we're going to have some discussions about that later on in this particular conference. And as I said, do we have the right model for innovation systems? Number 3, I kind of loosely call technological advances. Things like drones. I don't know if you can go back one page. This is a drone delivering a Walmart box. So back in 2003, when I gave that presidential address, the only time I ever heard about drones was in the context of the second, or the Gulf War, the Iraq War, which was just beginning in 2003. There was obviously a military application, or drones referred to what us university professors do quite a bit in the classroom. But clearly we're seeing, a huge increase in the applications of this type of drone technology. I read a really interesting story in the BBC News a couple of weeks ago about Amazon working on this idea of a floating warehouse, which is the blimp in the top picture there. So their idea is they'd have this floating warehouse concept, maybe at a sports fixture, for example. They could have this floating warehouse, and sports fans would, I want to order a T-shirt. I get on my smartphone, and the drone flies up, and I get my T-shirt or my bull cap or whatever it might be. So clearly we see the idea that drones could play a much more important role in terms of new delivery systems direct to consumers, but also perhaps at the agricultural level in terms of farm equipment parts. I'm harvesting and I suddenly need a piece of equipment. Is it possible for me to order it online and it comes to me via a drone? And clearly in the context of, as I talked about earlier, big data, we're seeing the use of drones to gather cropping data, cropping information, sensor information, and think about how we might use that type of information. I think Peter Phillips might touch on some of that tomorrow. So in some senses, you can think about these technologies having the capacity to reconfigure supply chains. We see new players, new roles. We see Amazon getting into food delivery and these types of things. I think thinking about how these new delivery systems and technologies influence the structure of supply chains is pretty relevant. Other kinds of technologies, self-driving vehicles, right, at the farm level, tractors, combines, grain trucks. So if we can have a Google car negotiate its way through the streets of LA, it's not too big a leap to think about, can we have a Google grain truck, for example? So what would that mean at the farm level? Certainly, the engineers suggest this is technologically feasible, right? We're able to, and we see lots of prototypes out there on the market. Is it economically feasible right now? I think is an open question. These are obviously pretty expensive technologies. But I think long-term we need to think about, well, what does that imply in terms of labor requirements on farms? Are they going to start to shift in terms of labor requirements and skill requirements? Do we now need someone, not someone who's going to drive a grain truck, but someone who can maybe fix a complicated computer system and so forth? And where's that labor going to come from? And maybe this also down the road enables remote multitasking by farmers. Can we see, farmers able to sit at home on a computer and do some of this stuff? And thinking about this, I was reminded about a farmer friend of mine. Some of you might recognize him. He's a pretty busy guy. So every May he's off seeding and harvesting in the fall. So I can sort of vision him sitting in his Mac in his office, running his grain truck rather than doing that in person. I'm told he's actually delayed his trip to France on sabbatical in the fall so he can stay around to drive the grain truck in September. So I'm sure his spouse would be really happy if he could remotely operate the grain truck from a vineyard in France. Other types of technology, online ordering, grocery delivery. This is a technology that's been around for quite a while. It's this technology that's been pretty slow, I think, to be taken up in Canada, but we are starting to see it. It's been in place for a number of years in other countries. The UK, for example, would be where you can order your groceries online. So clearly this creates new ways for food companies, retailers to engage with consumers. Back to data, again, I think that creates new sources or types of data on consumers that we maybe want to give some thought to, not just data on purchases, but how those purchases are made, where, what time of day, that type of thing. And of course, much more potential for more sophisticated marketing algorithms based on individual preferences. Netflix, Amazon already do that, right? Netflix suggests a movie to you based on what you've already watched, based on what people with similar preferences will do. And certainly I can see, that's potential for food sales in that way, suggesting food products to you based on what, how they've profiled you as a consumer. And again, questions around, what use is that data being put and what potential may it have. The other point I wanted to make about online ordering is what I've called this supply chain aggregators, for want of a better term. And if people have come across Skip the Dishes, this is actually a company that began in Winnipeg in 2013. Basically, home delivery of food is not new, but essentially what Winnipeg Free Press described it as a sophisticated IT and logistics company masquerading as a food delivery business. So you basically download the app and you want to order a meal to deliver to your home. It'll bring up the restaurants that are available that evening to deliver food, their menus, ratings by other consumers, and you can choose the food, and then Skip the Dishes or coordinates the delivery. Right? So I was working on this presentation, as I said, kind of over the holidays, and it was late at night. We were going to cook something, and it was too late. So I went on Skip the Dishes, and I ordered my dinner. So these are screenshots from my iPad of my dinner coming to me. It's very exciting. And this is, so I ordered it. It says delivery in 38 minutes. Your courier is completing other stops, and he's going to come to the restaurant. So you can sit at home and track in real time where this car is. So clearly it's using the same kind of GPS technology that Uber uses, and I'm sure a number of you have used this. So now I've discovered my dinner's being collected from the restaurant, and it's arriving soon. And at this point, if you wonder what people in Saskatchewan do on long, cold winter nights, this is it. So at this point, he went the wrong way, and I was yelling at my iPad, "You've gone the wrong way." So it's not as interactive as it might be. So clearly what we're seeing with this kind of what I would call a supply chain aggregator is an expanded customer base for small businesses. These are very small restaurants. They don't have to run their own delivery service. And of course, reduced search costs for consumers. I don't have to look through 10 flyers. I can go on, Skip the Dishes, and figure out what I might want to eat this evening. And then, of course, we can think about many other applications potentially beyond restaurant delivery that might use a similar kind of model. So I think those technologies are really quite exciting in terms of where they're taking value chains and the notion for new ways of thinking about food supply chains. Number 2, how am I doing for time? Good? Okay, all right. I had to talk about mergers. Of course, in a Canadian context, this is pretty important recently, that we've seen a number of high-profile mergers in the ag, or proposed mergers in the ag input sector, as well as the downstream sector. So Heinz and Kraft 2015 merger. But then just in the last year, Bayer and Monsanto, Dow DuPont, Chem China proposing to buy Syngenta, and of course Potash Corp and Agrium merging. There's again a recent paper in the last issue, I think it was, of Choices by May Civilli, I think I've pronounced that correctly, et al., that talks about the potential market and market share and price impacts of the proposed mergers in the ag biotech sector. So I've borrowed a couple of the tables and so forth from their paper, and they show, as we know, that over the last 20 years or so, a big increase in concentration, as we know, in the crop and seed biotech sector and in the ag chemical sectors. And of course, these mergers are just the latest step in that pattern of increased concentration. And the big six, as we tend to think about them, the big four, soon to be, I guess, have, of course, pretty complicated cross-licensing agreements among the big six, so it has some implications for ownership of IP, and there's been a lot of very useful work on patent thickets and so forth by Carl Prey and others, looking at what does that mean in terms of innovation and the capacity to innovate in this sector if you have very complicated IP ownership structures. So again, the impact that these mergers will have on that IP landscape is a pretty important question. In this particular paper in Choices, the authors look at the market share impacts and then use that to extrapolate what might be some of the price impacts of these recent proposed mergers in the crop seed biotech sector. So the Dow-DuPont merger, particularly important for corn seed and soybeans, so they suggest that there'll be a 41% market share in the corn seed market as a result of the Dow-DuPont merger, 38% for soybeans, but they forecast fairly modest price impacts in terms of input prices from those particular mergers, because they're arguing that these firms produce fairly diverse products. So corn, 2.3% price increase for corn seed. They're arguing about 1.9% increase for soybean seed. Monsanto, Bayer, cotton obviously is not a particularly relevant crop in a Canadian context, but you'll see why I put this up here in just a second. Much more bigger impact in terms of market share. So if that takeover goes through, the merged company would have about a 70% share of the cottonseed market with much more significant impacts on prices. So they estimate about an 18% price increase for cottonseed prices. And I put cotton up there because that clearly for Western Canada and for Canada, the impact on canola is really the thing that we might be most concerned with. So other sources suggest that this Bayer-Monsanto merger or takeover might give that merged entity about a 70% share of the canola seed market, but a 95% share of the herbicide-tolerant canola trait, a monopoly essentially. So clearly in terms of thinking about what does that mean in terms of price impacts for those herbicide-tolerant canola traits from the seeds, really important question that I think deserves some very close scrutiny and some analysis. Obviously, the Choices paper did not talk about canola, so I think some timely analysis looking at that is needed. So mergers and acquisitions, we're seeing clearly a shifting landscape, this notion of disruption to the ag-food sector. It's a pretty important one in terms of how that landscape is shifting. Maybe these firms are earning scale and scope economies that obviously have some benefits, but clearly we need to be thinking about what are the implications for input prices for producers, and also what are the potential implications for IP ownership and R&D investment. What does this do in terms of those ownership of that IP, those patents? Does this ease things up, or does this reduce the incentive to innovate? So it clearly warrants further scrutiny from regulators just to tease out where that might be. Okay, and my number one, I said this is maybe a strategic choice. What's my number one source of exogenous shock or disruption to the ag-food sector? Here he is. But not just President-elect Trump. I think I'd put, this is Brexit. right? So in that context, are we seeing a retreat from globalization, right, in terms of where things are going in international trade context? Anti-globalization, again, is not new, but maybe back in 2003 it was more of a fringe element, and I think we see that much more mainstream now. It's pretty easy to find those kinds of images that I've put up here. And if we look at some of the dialogue that happened around the last election in the US, around Brexit, clearly there's a strong undercurrent of dissatisfaction with the distribution of gains from trade and economic growth, particularly regionally in the US, but also in the UK. Very much, you get a very different regional economic conditions and so forth. So this notion, for some people, that they were just plain left behind. And also quite concerning is this sort of sense of anti-expert credibility gap. I happened to be in the UK about 5 or 6 weeks before the Brexit vote, and I was struck and disappointed actually by the level of discourse there and the amount of misinformation that was coming out about trade, about the implications for the UK economy of leaving Europe, and stuff that plainly wasn't true. Getting as much credibility as you might have 9 or 10 very credible economic organizations. You might have the governor of the Bank of England warning about the economic impacts. Obviously, a lot of people just ignored that and would prefer to listen to 1 or 2 people with a view. Again, going back to this notion of confirmation bias that confirm their existing views. So this notion of a credibility gap, and this question I think is important for all of us, is why as economists do we sort of fail to tell a convincing story about the general gains from trade and economic growth that closer economic integration we tend to think brings. So looking forward for the Canadian ag-food sector, what can we say? Well, not too much. I mean, obviously uncertainty right now. We're not really sure, particularly for President-elect Trump, the kinds of decisions he's going to make, and uncertainty generally is not good for business. Potentially the rise of protectionism or certainly nationalism in the guise of patriotism, right? So a president-elect leaning on individual companies in terms of where they make their plant investment decisions is fairly unusual. Obviously, as an export-dependent ag sector, implications for export market access are really important. So probably, I think as most of us think, TPP's probably done. Are we going to renegotiate NAFTA? I see in the conference package you had some really nice short policy briefs from the Institute for Advanced Study of Food and Ag Policy at Guelph by a number of people in the room that sort of asked some questions around renegotiating NAFTA, what that might mean for the ag food system. So I encourage you to take a look at those. For Canada, obviously CETA is hopefully going ahead, but CETA minus the UK market, what does that mean for the Canadian ag-food sector? When we were looking at the potential gains from that trade agreement, it's obviously a fairly different landscape now. And the WTO, of course, is still kind of stalled with the Doha round. So this is my last slide. Again, back to that initial theme of exogenous shocks and agile value chains. That was kind of a theme, exogenous shocks and institutional adaptation, that I talked way back in 2003. And I'd say, fast forward 14 years, the old issues, food safety, food quality attributes, environment, transformative technologies, still really relevant, but obviously the world doesn't stand still. So we have a whole bunch of new words in our lexicon that really we just weren't talking about 14 years ago. Social license, social media, authenticity, big data, drones, Brexit, Trump, and so forth. And then maybe new nuances for the old words, increased complexity about what we mean by sustainability, new mergers, continuing to talk about innovation. So all of that requires, as the conference theme suggests, agile and adaptive value chains and a facilitating institutional and policy environment. Thank you.